A signal that should not have existed carried 206.25 gigabits of real data every second inside a Chinese lab in January of 2022. For decades, this particular frequency band was treated as dead space. Too high for ordinary radio chips, too low for lasers, useful for almost nothing. Then a team in Nanjing found a way to generate a usable signal inside that exact gap. That is not a theoretical projection. That is a verified transmission from Purple Mountain Laboratories, confirmed with Southeast University and China Mobile as partners. You have felt a stadium Wi-Fi signal collapse the second everyone around you reached for their phone at once. Let me tell you what that actually means in plain English. And here's the part that blows people's minds. This record is not the ceiling. The ceiling everyone in this industry is racing toward is 100 times faster than 5G. Hit a quick like and subscribe, because by the end of this video you will understand exactly what stands between here and there. 10 gigabits per second. That is the peak theoretical speed of 5G, the number printed on marketing slides and quoted in press releases. Now here is what nobody puts on the slide. The average real-world 5G connection in most cities does not come close to that ceiling. It moves at a fraction of it, choked by crowded frequencies that every phone, router, and smart device in range is fighting over. You know that fight personally. It is the reason a video call freezes the second you walk into an elevator, the reason a stadium signal collapses the moment 40,000 people reach for their phones at the same time, the reason a downtown office building can feel like a dead zone despite sitting directly beneath a cell tower. For years, the telecom industry treated this as a hard physical wall, not a temporary inconvenience. The problem was never the equipment sitting on the tower. The problem was the spectrum itself. The usable radio frequencies were treated like a single-lane road at rush hour, and no amount of better engineering could widen a road that physically did not exist. Here's what most people get wrong about that wall. It was not that engineers could not imagine something faster. It was that the frequencies capable of carrying something faster were considered unusable. A graveyard band sitting between ordinary radio and visible light, discarded by 2 entire generations of communication engineers because nothing could reliably generate a clean signal there. Textbooks did not describe it as an opportunity. They described it as a boundary, the point past which the physics simply stopped cooperating. One person refused to accept that verdict. Professor Yu Xiaohu, chief scientist at Purple Mountain Laboratories in Nanjing, spent years pointed at exactly that graveyard band while most of the telecom world moved on to easier problems. Colleagues in the field considered the Terahertz spectrum a research curiosity at best. The kind of frequency you study in a physics paper, not the kind you build a national communications network on. Yu Xiaohu made a different bet. His stated goal was blunt: prove that the Terahertz band, the one everyone else had quietly written off as dead spectrum, could carry a real, usable, real-time signal, not in theory. In a working lab with a working measurement that other scientists could independently verify. That bet was not cheap. It meant years of research funding aimed at a frequency band with no existing commercial application, no guaranteed payoff, and a research community that treated the entire pursuit with polite skepticism. Here is the detail that puts everything into perspective. While most 6G research worldwide was focused on squeezing more efficiency out of existing 5G frequencies, Yu Xiaohu's team was trying to prove that an entirely different, unused part of the spectrum could be tamed at all. A much harder, much slower, much riskier problem to attach a career to. But a wall this well-established does not fall on ambition alone. It falls when someone produces a number the rest of the field cannot argue with. And that number was coming. On a January morning in 2022, Purple Mountain Laboratories published the number online: 206.25 gigabits per second, achieved in real time in the Terahertz band, working alongside China Mobile, Fudan University, Southeast University, and Pengcheng Laboratory. The stated goal was specific. Not a theoretical ceiling, but a working demonstration that the Terahertz band could carry standardized, real-time wireless traffic like any other commercial frequency, under conditions other researchers could independently check. The reaction from the wider telecom world was polite, and it was skeptical. Standards engineers pointed out, correctly, that terahertz signals barely travel a few yards before losing coherence. A rain cloud can scatter them. A raised hand can block them entirely. Several international commentators filed the result under laboratory curiosity, impressive on paper, irrelevant to an actual mobile network where a signal has to survive rain, walls, crowds, and distance, not just a clean line of sight across a test bench. They said the same thing about fiber optic cable. In the 1970s, telecom engineers dismissed glass fiber as too fragile and too short range to ever replace copper wire in a real network. A strand of glass thinner than a human hair, expected to carry a nation's phone calls. It took roughly 20 years for that dismissal to be proven catastrophically wrong. Fiber did not just replace copper. It became the backbone of the entire internet, the physical layer underneath nearly everything that followed. Here is where the consensus broke a second time. The program behind the 206 gigabit result was not chasing raw signal strength in isolation. It was built around a technique called photonic terahertz generation, using two separate lightwave beams tuned to slightly different frequencies. When those two beams were aimed at each other, the difference between them landed exactly inside the terahertz gap, producing a usable carrier signal where ordinary radio electronics simply could not reach. That detail rarely makes it into public coverage of the record. Most reporting stopped at the headline number and moved on. The actual innovation was not that a lab hit a big number. It was that a team had found a physical trick to generate a signal inside a frequency range every major telecom equipment maker considered off-limits, using tools that already existed, arranged in a way nobody had tried at this scale. But here's the thing. As extraordinary as that number was, it was still not the real mechanism story. The real story is what that photonic trick actually does once you slow it down and look at how it works. And that part sounds almost too simple to be real. Here's the problem with generating a terahertz signal using conventional equipment. Ordinary radio chips are built to vibrate electrons at frequencies up to roughly 100 gigahertz. Fast, but nowhere near fast enough. Lasers, on the other hand, operate at frequencies so high they are measured in hundreds of terahertz, wildly overshooting the target from the other direction. The terahertz band sits in a gap between the two, a frequency range where neither electronics nor optics could comfortably operate. A no-man's land that both fields approached from opposite ends and neither could fully occupy. Think of it like trying to whistle a note that sits exactly between two instruments' ranges. A tuba cannot reach it. A piccolo overshoots it by miles. Neither one on its own was ever going to hit that note cleanly, no matter how skilled the player. This was the exact problem Yu Xiaohu had been circling for years. Instead of forcing electronics to vibrate faster or forcing light to slow down, his team took two separate lightwave beams, tuned to frequencies close to each other but not identical, and aimed them at the same target. When two light waves that close in frequency overlap, they beat against each other. And the difference between them, the leftover frequency from that collision, lands precisely inside the terahertz gap. Neither a radio chip nor a laser generates the signal directly. The gap between two lasers does. The result, measured and published, a single wavelength net rate of 103.125 gigabits per second and, using two beams instead of one, a dual wavelength rate of 206.25 gigabits per second in real time, not as an average lab estimate stitched together after the fact. That is not an incremental gain over 5G. That is a signal generated inside a frequency range the entire telecom industry had spent 2 decades treating as unusable. The mechanism worked. But a working signal generator sitting on a lab bench is not the same thing as a signal that survives contact with a hallway, a rainstorm, or a crowd of people between the transmitter and the phone in your pocket. That problem was still completely unsolved, and solving it required doing something that sounded on paper like it should not work at all. Terahertz signals carry an enormous amount of data. They also die almost immediately. A wavelength that short gets swallowed by rain, deflected by walls, and blocked outright by something as simple as a raised hand between a transmitter and a receiver. The very property that gives terahertz its bandwidth, its tiny wavelength, is the same property that makes it almost useless outside a sealed lab, which is precisely why so many engineers had walked away from it decades earlier. For a while, the team's instinct was to fight that fragility directly, boost power, narrow the beam, brute force the signal through obstacles the way earlier radio systems always had. Here's where it gets uncomfortable. More power does not fix a blocked signal. It just wastes more power on a signal that is still blocked, running up costs without solving the underlying problem. Then came the detail that changed the entire calculation. What if, instead of fighting the fragility, The network was built to see the obstacles coming and route around them in real time. That is a paradigm break, and it is not an obvious one. It meant merging communication and sensing into a single signal rather than treating them as two separate systems bolted together, each with its own hardware and its own budget. The team did not have to invent this from theory alone, they tested it. At Purple Mountain's field site, a communication-based station transmitted a wireless signal toward a moving drone. The signal reflected off the drone and returned to the station, and the base station analyzed that reflected wave to calculate the drone's exact position, using the same signal that was carrying data, not a separate radar system running alongside it. Engineers on the team have said this detail rarely makes it into public reporting, but it was the harder bet of the entire program, betting that one signal could do two jobs simultaneously, when the conventional wisdom said combining sensing and communication would degrade both. It sounds like it should not work. That is exactly why it does. Colleagues told the team a combined system would be slower at both tasks than two separate specialized systems, that trying to make one signal do the work of two was a compromise dressed up as innovation. That is not what the field data showed. The combined signal handled positioning and data transmission at once, in the same test window, without a second radar system running in parallel, and without the performance penalty critics predicted. Mechanisms that work in a single field test are not the same thing as mechanisms that work across an entire country. Coordinating this at national scale was an entirely different kind of problem, and it required more than one lab, more than one institution, and more patience than any single team could supply alone. A single lab result, however impressive, does not become a national communication standard by itself. That took coordination. Spectrum regulators, chip makers, universities, and carriers all solving different pieces of the same puzzle, on a timeline set by China's Ministry of Industry and Information Technology, with no single actor able to force the pace alone. The old approach to next-generation wireless looked like isolated fiefdoms. One lab chasing spectrum, another chasing hardware, a third chasing standards with little coordination between them. That approach produces impressive headlines and very few working networks, because a record set in one lab means nothing if the surrounding infrastructure cannot use it. The new approach discarded that model entirely. In 2026, the Ministry of Industry and Information Technology confirmed that the first phase of China's national 6G trials had wrapped, yielding over 300 distinct technical advances across chips, spectrum, and network architecture, accumulated over 4 consecutive years of coordinated testing. In May of that year, regulators approved trial spectrum in the 6 GHz band specifically for field deployment, not lab benches, actual regional trials, with a formal license issued to the National 6G Coordination Body, responsible for turning individual lab wins into shared infrastructure. On the hardware side, a joint Hong Kong-Beijing research team, publishing through Nature, demonstrated something just as consequential as the spectrum itself. A single chip capable of tuning across the entire usable wireless spectrum, from half a gigahertz all the way up to 115 gigahertz. Today, covering that same range takes 9 separate radio systems, each built for its own narrow slice of frequency, each with its own power draw and its own physical footprint. This is not just a couple of incremental chip improvements. We are talking about a single chip that replaces low-band rural coverage, mid-band urban traffic, and high-band millimeter wave. The kind of unification that used to require an entire equipment rack, now handled by something the size of a coin, small enough to sit inside a standard smartphone. Layer that hardware unification on top of the sensing integrated network from Purple Mountain's field tests, and you get something closer to a coordinated nervous system than a traditional cell network. A system that senses obstacles, reroutes signal, and covers frequency ranges that used to require separate hardware for each band. Picture it, like a single translator, fluent in every dialect spoken across an entire country, replacing a room full of specialists who could each only handle one and who had to hand a conversation off between them every time the topic shifted. The verdict: no single lab result gets you to a usable network. Coordinated infrastructure does. All of that coordination was aimed at one number, the number that would tell everyone whether 6G could actually approach the ceiling the industry had been quoting for years. That number needed independent trial verification before anyone was willing to say it out loud. Here is the honest picture. The 100 times faster than 5G figure that gets quoted everywhere is not a single certified result from a single Chinese lab. It is the industry-wide theoretical ceiling for 6G as a technology. 1 terabit per second, peak, against 5G's, roughly 10 gigabit peak. No commercial network anywhere on Earth is delivering that yet, and it is worth saying plainly, real-world speeds. Once 6G reaches ordinary phones, will land well below that peak number, the same way 5G's real average trails its own advertised ceiling today. That gap between peak and average is not a flaw unique to China's program. It is a pattern every generation of wireless technology has followed. What is certified, named, and independently verified is this: Purple Mountain Laboratories, 206.25 gigabit real-time transmission, confirmed alongside China Mobile, Fudan University, and Southeast University. A result, Purple Mountain itself has stated could scale toward roughly 20 times 5G's peak rate as the terahertz band matures. Beyond that lab record, trade press coverage of a trial network near Huairu outside Beijing has reported peak downlink speeds approaching 1 terabit per second under trial conditions, real movement toward the full 100 times ceiling, though not yet a commercially deployed, independently certified figure in the way the 206 gigabit result is. Translate that into something you can picture. A full high-definition film library, the kind that takes minutes to download on a strong home connection today, moving in roughly the time it takes to read this sentence. Under trial conditions. Not a promise. A measurement, even if it is one still confined to a test network rather than the phone in your pocket. This is the answer to the bet Yu Xiaohu made years earlier when the terahertz band was considered dead spectrum and his own field treated the pursuit with polite skepticism. The frequency nobody wanted is now the frequency the entire national program is built around, and the number that once sounded like a rounding error is now treated as the foundation everything else sits on. If that surprised you, the next part is going to be even harder to believe. Hit subscribe so you are there when we cover it. The certified number is real. The full ceiling is still ahead. And the honest distance between those two numbers is exactly why the rest of the world is paying attention right now, rather than dismissing this in the way they dismissed the lab result back in 2022. Every carrier on Earth is approaching the same wall 5G ran into. Spectrum crowding that only gets worse as more devices, sensors, and connected machines compete for the same limited frequencies. That is an engineering problem every telecom industry on the planet is going to hit on the same timeline, because the physics of crowded spectrum does not care where the equipment is built or which company's logo is on the tower. The International Telecommunication Union and the standards body known as Third Generation Partnership Project, or 3GPP, are the bodies actually responsible for turning lab records into a global standard every device on Earth can use. As of 2026, those bodies were only beginning to formalize core 6G specifications, meaning the technology exists in trial form well before the rulebook that lets manufacturers worldwide build compatible devices catches up, a gap that has existed at the start of every wireless generation before this one. Adoption is not a software update. 6G requires entirely new base stations, new antennas, and new chips. The terahertz and sensing integrated architecture described here is not backward compatible with existing 5G towers. That is a genuinely hard, slow, expensive global rollout, the kind that takes the better part of a decade even once the engineering is finished, because towers have to be physically replaced, not remotely updated. The same pattern of underestimation shows up in fiber optic history. When glass fiber was first proposed as a replacement for copper telephone wire, the industry consensus dismissed it as too fragile for a real network. A dismissal that held for roughly 2 decades before fiber became the backbone of the modern internet. Sensing integrated wireless networks are being met with a similar mix of genuine engineering skepticism and quiet underestimation right now, from people making the same category of argument for the same category of reason. Here is what makes the real advantage genuinely hard to copy. It is not the spectrum license, and it is not a single patent. It is the accumulated trial data, the 300-plus technical advances banked across 4 years of coordinated national testing, the kind of practical, hard-won engineering knowledge that does not transfer with a blueprint, because it lives in the failures nobody publishes as much as the successes that make headlines. The limit here was never political. It was physical. A gap in the usable spectrum that took a specific technical bet, sustained over years, to close. And the network itself is only half of that story. None of this terahertz bandwidth means anything without hardware capable of physically handling it, which is exactly the chip-level breakthrough worth understanding next, the one making a lot of existing silicon look outdated by comparison. Step back from the individual numbers for a moment, because the real story here is bigger than any single gigabit figure. A frequency band that 2 entire generations of engineers wrote off as unusable is becoming the foundation for a communication system that does not just move data faster, it senses the physical world around it while doing so. That is a different category of network than the one currently in your pocket, not just a faster version of the same thing, and the distinction matters more than the speed figure alone. If you made it this far, you now understand more about how 6G actually works than most people who write headlines about it for a living. Here's what was actually proven. Dead spectrum was not actually dead. It was unexploited, waiting on a specific technical trick nobody had assembled yet. Fragility that looked like a dead end turned out to be solvable by merging sensing and communication into a single signal, instead of treating them as separate problems requiring separate budgets. And the 100 times faster than 5G number, the one that sounds like marketing, is a real industry ceiling that trial networks are now closing in on, verified step by verified step, rather than a number invented for a press release. Yu Xiaohu spent years defending a frequency band nobody else in his field wanted to touch, at a cost to his own research trajectory that most academics would not have accepted. What he built is no longer a personal bet sitting in a research paper. It is the spectrum, a national program, dozens of institutions, and an entire next generation of wireless infrastructure are now standing on. If this changed how you think about what faster internet actually requires, hit that like button and subscribe so you never miss what comes next. Now, I want to hear from you in the comments. As networks start sensing the physical world around them along with carrying your data, is that the exciting future of infrastructure, or is always-on environmental sensing a trade-off we should be a lot more cautious about? I read every single one. See you in the next one.